Welcome back, everyone, to our first reaction video in about a week. I just arrived home from our trip to New England, actually about an hour ago. Had just enough time to open up my new West Brom jersey that I got today. I love it. I love that it's got the 23rd Psalm written into the blue. I know a lot of people aren't crazy about it because it doesn't really have the stripes that West Brom's known for, but I absolutely love it. It's the first jersey I've ordered. I'll probably eventually get the whole kit, but for now I've just got the jersey. And then I've got about 2 hours before I take my son to his first travel soccer practice of the summer. So not a lot of rest for the weary, but a couple of real quick things. Return of daily content starts today. Tomorrow we'll start doing daily content once again on the gaming channel. And also, I'm going to get all caught up on patron messages, caught up on what's going on in Discord. I've stayed away from that stuff for the most part. I tried to reply to some comments and stuff on YouTube, but wanted to be present with my family for our first vacation in 5 years, so I didn't do too much online while we were gone. Do have some original content coming. You're going to see our visit to the Plymouth Plantation, which is kind of a living history showing what life was like in 1627 Plymouth. You're going to see some of our visit to Plymouth Rock and the recreation of the Mayflower. You'll also see, you've already seen my trip to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's hometown. And you'll see a little bit from some cemeteries as well. So this was recommended to me on YouTube, and it's a short video, so I thought it'd be a good reaction content for today since I'm just getting back into the swing of things. So this is, it looks like it's from Yarn Hub, and it is a video about Charles Lightoller. Now, Yarn Hub does great stuff. Their animation's fantastic. They do these short videos, but they pack it full of content. Make sure you check them out. Subscribe to their channel. I'll put a link in the description to the original video. This is about Charles Lightoller. So I'll tell you up front kind of what I know about Charles Lightoller. I know he was the second officer on the Titanic. He was the senior surviving officer on the Titanic. Captain Smith died that night, as did First Officer Murdoch, leaving Lightoller as the surviving officer, highest ranking surviving officer. I believe that he ended up in the water afterwards and got initially sucked down with the ship. He was stuck to one of the grates, and then like a blast of hot air shot him up. He ended up with one of the collapsible boats that had turned over and actually saved a lot of lives that night by organizing things on that boat. I don't know a lot beyond that. I know that he was involved in the rescue at Dunkirk during World War II. I think he was a World War I officer. Dunkirk and World War II, he captained one of the ships that helped rescue people. But beyond that, I don't know much about him. So I'm excited to dive in and see what I can learn, and I'll offer some comment as we go along. Let's check it out.
It's the night of April the 14th, 1912, and the Titanic is on its maiden voyage. All the crew know that ice might be sighted.
All right. So right off the bat, we've got Leonardo DiCaprio shouting "I'm king of the world" out on the front, so that was pretty cool.
However, it's a moonless, quiet, starlit night with no cloud. The sea is as still as a mill pond. Not a breath of wind, and the sea like a sheet of glass, making the detection of icebergs very difficult.
And why that makes it difficult to detect icebergs is because when you have wind, you have waves. And when you have waves, you have the white of the caps of the waves. When they splash into something, you can see that. When there's no waves, nothing's happening to interact with the iceberg. And if you don't have much moonlight, you have nothing to reflect. And so it would be very difficult, especially because their binoculars were locked and they didn't have the key.
A telegram is received on the Titanic's wireless, warning all ships of heavy icebergs in an area just ahead of the Titanic.
Several telegrams.
However, the second officer and the one on watch, Charles Lightoller, never receives the communication, and the ship steams on at 22 knots. At 10 p.m., he was relieved by First Officer William Murdoch and retires below. A bell sharply rings out from the crow's nest 3 times, and the call is heard. "Ice right ahead, sir." The command is given. "Hard a starboard, full speed astern."
Now, it's funny because I get a lot of comments when I do Titanic content when I mention that the order was hard a starboard, and everybody's like, "Don't you know starboard is right and port is left?" Yes, I do know that, and I also know that that's the order you give when you want to turn left hard. Hard a starboard. It doesn't sound right, but it is. Hard a starboard is what you do if you want to turn left. And then he said that Murdoch said he tried to port round it, which means to turn back to the right. Starboard's right, but porting around means to turn right. Hard a starboard is left. It's just the way it's seamen speak.
But it's too late. and the ship has been struck as ice falls on the foredeck. No one knows the ship has been pierced 6 or more times below the waterline on the starboard side. From this moment, nothing can save her.
And that's another thing. When they first found Titanic back in '85, the idea had always been that this long 300-foot gash had been carved along the side of the Titanic. Now, it's pretty well understood that it was actually kind of a series of punches into the side of the ship, and it was something to do with the way the rivets were made, were attached, that it actually kind of buckled rather than just kind of tearing along. It kind of buckled, and just kind of poked these, kind of blunt force trauma into the side of the ship.
Lightoller, on his bunk, feels a slight jar, a shiver that ran through the ship. The 4th officer puts his head around the door and says, "Do you know we struck an iceberg? The water is up to F deck in the mailroom." Lightoller runs up to the deck. The ship is stopped, and the steam from all the boilers is roaring through the exhausts. The noise is deafening. Lightoller sees the captain, cups his hands over his ear and shouts, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" The captain nods, and Charles sets about loading the lifeboats, strictly enforcing the women and children first protocol.
Yeah, more than anybody else in the crew, he was the one who really enforced that. And the only men that he allowed on any ships were men that, or any lifeboats were men that were specifically needed, like members of the crew, to kind of keep order and to kind of organize what was supposed to be done, like actual seamen on the vessels.
Only allowing men to board the lifeboats in the capacity of auxiliary seamen. Everyone, including Charles at this stage, thought it was just a precautionary measure and the ship wouldn't founder. In his book, he recounted, "Actually, the Titanic was so constructed and divided into watertight compartments that she would float with any 2 compartments full of water, and the margin of safety made it fairly certain that she would still have floated, even with 3 of the 4 forward compartments full up. Although I was fairly confident in my own mind that she would not sink, one has no right to risk an error of judgment that may entail loss of life."
And the problem, too, what ends up dooming Titanic is that not only do they have multiple gashes which flood all of these forward compartments, but I think the watertight compartments only went as high as the E deck, which means as soon as they got above that, the water would just flow over top from one into the next, and then it was just a matter of time.
Has no right to risk an error of judgment that may entail loss of life, particularly when it is the case of the passengers you are carrying. As it turned out, she was holed in no less than 6 compartments along the starboard side, and nothing could have saved her. By the time half the boats were gone, the bow started to go lower, and the creeping dread of the high water made it clear that it was only time before she would slip beneath the surface. The band started playing "Nearer My God to Thee."
Now, here's an interesting thing, because you hear the tune playing in the background, and that is "Nearer My God to Thee" as far as like the one I've always heard. But my understanding is there are 2 versions of that song, and the one that they played on the Titanic, Wallace Hartley was the band leader, was the other version, not the one that goes "Nearer my God to thee, nearer to thee." That's the one everybody knows now. That wasn't probably the one that they played. Wallace Hartley, by the way, heroic actions that night. It seems like a small thing to stay and play music, but when everybody else is running for their lives and you very calmly are doing that, it's a big deal. And it hopefully brought some calm to the situation, or at least brought some peace to people who were kind of coming to acceptance with the fact that they were probably going to die, as the majority of the people on the ship did. I think they found his body, but he may have been reburied at sea. They found hundreds of bodies after, but a lot of them they only saved, it's kind of sad, but this is the reality, they only really saved the bodies of the first class people and sometimes second class. Like third class passengers, they just buried them at sea after they kind of tried to identify who they were, or at least information about the bodies they found, just reburied them at sea. I don't think Wallace Hartley ended up making it to be buried. I'm not sure, but I know they found his violin. I think it might have been strapped to him.
Attempting to launch a lifeboat, Charles found it was already occupied by 25 male passengers. He forced them out of the boat, yelling, "Get out of there, you damn cowards! I'd like to see every one of you overboard!" The boat was lowered successfully, although some were not filled to capacity, in part due to concerns that the winch system would not take the weight of a fully loaded lifeboat. The last boat was a collapsible raft stowed upside down on the officers' quarters. Lightoller and another seaman cut the life raft free and threw it down on the water, which was now above the boat deck. The Titanic took a sudden dip, and people were washed into the sea. Charles started to swim away but got sucked down and trapped against a grate. That would have been the end for Lightoller had a boiler not exploded. In the swirling mass of water, he got pushed back up to the surface and found himself near the collapsible raft he had...
Could you imagine the horror of that moment, being sucked against a grate and the suction of the ship pulling down? The ship, it sank at a pretty remarkable speed. I think they said it was probably going like 45 miles an hour underwater as it headed toward the seafloor. It sank all the way the 2.5 miles in like less than 10 minutes. And so, oh man, how horrifying that must have been. And then to have that boiler explode from the rushing water, push you up. And that water was so cold. It was like 20 degrees. It's just ridiculously cold water. You can't even wrap your mind around what that must have felt like, or just numbing.
Released earlier. The raft was upside down, but Charles hung onto a rope attached to it. The cables holding one of the Titanic's gigantic funnels gave way, and the huge funnel fell into the icy water, missing Charles by inches.
Jeez.
The impact washed the raft clear of the sinking ship. There were about 30 people who scrambled aboard the upturned raft, including Lightoller. Taking charge, he watched as the huge liner sunk to the depths below. He later credited his faith with his survival and said, "With God, all things are possible." After being rescued and as the most senior member of the crew to return from that fateful voyage, Lightoller was called to testify in several inquiries. There was suspicion that his testimony wasn't completely truthful, and there was a certain amount of shame attached to being the most senior officer to survive.
Yeah, because why didn't you go down with the ship? And the funny thing is, there are some eyewitness accounts that actually say that Captain Smith also initially survived the sinking, that he kind of floated up next to one of the lifeboats, and that people actually tried to bring him in, and he refused to be rescued. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I don't know why somebody would lie about something like that.
Which must have been hard to bear. In 1916, he was in the Royal Navy and captain of a torpedo boat. The boat was in the Thames estuary when it encountered the L-31 Zeppelin. These super Zeppelins were a triumph of German engineering. They were vast at almost 200 meters long and 24 meters wide, and had been wreaking havoc in London. Lightoller decided to lie in wait in the Thames and ready the anti-aircraft gun with a tracer round. From his book, in his own words, he said, "Amongst my signalmen, I had a chap who had the most extraordinary acute hearing. I've known him to hear and describe sounds quite outside the ken of anyone on board."
That's impressive. And why a tracer round? I would guess because the tracer rounds are usually made of like a burning phosphorus, I think, so that they glow. And so that would obviously ignite the gas that's inside the Zeppelin.
I told number one to put him on the bridge with nothing else to do but to keep his ears open. Only 10 minutes later, he signaled that he could hear something, and the Zeppelin airship loomed into view immediately above the boat. A battle took place and 2 tracers hit the Zeppelin in the tail. In return, the airship dropped a storm of bombs, in part in retaliation, but also to lighten the load so that the ship could rise and escape. Lightoller said, "How on earth we didn't set him on fire and bring him down, heaven alone knows. Just absolute rotten bad luck." The Zeppelin was forced to withdraw and got away, but the encounter and his actions earned Charles the Distinguished Service Cross. He was later given command of HMS Gary, a river-class destroyer. One of the more darker points in Lightoller's career occurred during this time, when as captain he was accused of a brutal incident. He had successfully depth-charged, rammed and sunk a U-boat. The surviving crew were swimming, and Lightoller would not accept their surrender. What's more, the crew of the Gary allegedly opened fire on the survivors under the orders of its captain. In his memoirs, the commander of the U-boat said that this continued until other ships arrived, at which point, as if by magic, the British now let down some lifeboats into the water.
Interesting.
Lightoller never admitted the incident, but later wrote in his memoirs, "Towards the submarine men, one felt an utter disgust and loathing. They were nothing but an abomination, polluting the clean sea."
So, yeah, there's kind of this attitude that submariners are almost cheating, and they're not kind of, there's this certain, I don't know what the word is, kind of chivalry to naval warfare, and they feel like these new submarines were not new in World War I, but this was the first time they were used on a large scale successfully. And there were a lot of people like Lightoller who had this attitude that this was kind of dirty tactics because the submarines had been doing unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking civilian vessels because they were being used to carry supplies and things like that. I understand not picking up survivors because of fear of other U-boats in the area, perhaps. But this seems like he took it maybe a step further, and he doesn't seem to have been too apologetic about that.
After the war, Charles Lightoller retired and purchased a motor yacht called the Sundowner. He wrote an autobiography, Titanic and Other Ships, which sold well until Marconi forced the book to be removed from sale due to his comments on the role of the Marconi radio operators in the Titanic disaster. In 1939, at the outbreak of war, his youngest son, Herbert, became one of the first casualties of the conflict and was killed in action on the 4th of September.
Oh, wow.
Herbert was in the Royal Air Force and had spoken to his father about aviation, and in particular the process of how a plane targets a ship. Charles listened and learned, a lesson that was particularly useful when in 1940 the Sundowner was requisitioned by the Navy to help with the evacuation of Dunkirk.
Operation Dynamo.
He was told to...
This Operation Dynamo, to me, is just one of the all-time coolest things that a group of civilians have done in wartime. And if you've seen the movie Dunkirk, you're at least a little bit familiar with this, where basically every civilian vessel that was like, I think at least a certain length, like maybe 50 feet or something, I don't remember what it was requisitioned, and they brought all these ships across to help rescue the majority of British soldiers that were trapped at Dunkirk. Just an incredible feat.
Take his motor yacht to Ramsgate, where he would give the boat to a Navy crew. He refused, saying, "If anyone was going to take her over, well, my eldest son and I were." Charles set off to cross the English Channel with his eldest son, Roger, and a 19-year-old Sea Scout. The boat was licensed to carry 21 passengers. Charles loaded the ship with 127 servicemen,
Nice.
75 below deck, and the rest on top.
Good for him.
On the way back, they were attacked by a Stuka. Charles remembered what his son Herbert had told him and stood on the bow. As the Stuka screamed down and lined up his bombing run, Charles waited and watched, and at the last possible moment, he yelled out to turn the boat, and the bomb splashed harmlessly on the starboard side of the Sundowner. Returning to Ramsgate, he unloaded the men, where the chief petty officer exclaimed to Charles, "My God, mate, where did you put him?" If parts of this story sound familiar, in 2017, Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk was released, where the character Mr. Dawson, played by Mark Rylance, was inspired by Charles.
Okay, I thought some of that seemed familiar to... Mark Rylance is a fantastic actor, by the way. He played Thomas Cromwell in Wolf Hall. It was the first real experience I had with him as an actor. And yeah, I thought the story sounded a little familiar to his. Okay, that makes total sense.
Lightoller. Lightoller died in 1952, but his motor yacht, the Sundowner, can be visited today in the Ramsgate Maritime Museum.
Oh, I may have to check that out. That's really cool. Like I said, I love Yarn Hub stuff. I think they have just the right amount of information and also emotional pull into their stories that really draw you in. So definitely check their channel out. Let's continue this conversation. What can you add to this? What else do you know about these stories? I'll put a link in the description to a reaction I did a while back where we watched the Titanic sinking in real time. It's not 2.5 hours long like the real time. I skipped around and stuff, but so to give you a little bit more depth as we talked about that. But let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we will see you again tomorrow with another reaction video. Thanks for watching.